Czy mogłabyś powiedzieć
Could you
coś
say
o
something
sobie,
about yourself?
o swojej rodzinie, o
your
otoczeniu
family,
najbliższym,
your
w
closest
jakiej
environment?
atmosferze się wychowywałaś?
Did the environment you were
w jakiej
raised in have a
atmosferze się
connection to
wychowywałaś,
your later
miało
involvement in
związek z
human
twoim
rights
późniejszym
issues
zaangażowaniem na rzecz praw
and
człowieka,
women's
praw
rights?
kobiet?
I don't know if there's a connection, for one. We can never know whether there is a connection. Of course, very many psychologists, both men and women, would notice a connection, but I don't know that. It could have had, it could not have had, but I don't know that. But of course, I can say a couple of words about myself. I was born after the war, after the Second World War, in '46. I had 4 siblings. There were a lot of us at home, 5 people and both parents. And my mother was a very sincere, nice, warm person, but emotionally immature. That is, she couldn't take care of and take responsibility for raising such a big group of children. Particularly because things were very hard in Poland then, money-wise. She really wanted to be a good mother, and she had many wonderful character traits, but she didn't always succeed at being a good mother. My father, in turn, was, one could say, a very difficult person. He was a doctor, so in Poland's case it was not, I mean, we weren't a poor family, but generally Poland was a poor country. So with that many children, there were sometimes financial problems. Just like in the case of most families in Poland. Our home was dominated by an atmosphere of great discipline, or even intimidation, because father was a very stern, incredibly stern person, and my mom wasn't able to cope with this. Did this have an impact on me later in life? Frankly speaking, I don't know. We could very easily say that it did. We could accept this version that it had a huge impact, because my mom was dominated by a man. She was a person who was not independent, but subordinated to him. Above all else, she was financially dependent on him, and perhaps also emotionally dependent. She would try to solve very difficult situations, or play them out, in the so-called feminine way, that is by evasions, ruses, small deceits, and tricks, while father was seemingly macho. One could say that it had an impact, but could have just as well not have had an impact. I don't really know. It's hard for me to say what could have been, since perhaps some of these things are, it seems to me, too simple. I mean, the warm, nice, but not very mature mother, you know, the stereotype, who can't control the situation, and the domineering father, seemingly powerful, who was an alcoholic, and practically speaking, a house tyrant, intimidating the children. But all in all, after the years, I got to understand that he was a weak man, pitiful in a way. He was very intelligent, very talented, a great doctor with the soul of an artist. He had great, huge talents. He was musically talented. There was a lot of music at home, but the atmosphere was really heavy. I had the so-called difficult childhood. I came from a discordant, unharmonious family, where there was a lot of this damaged love. That's how I could describe it.
Did you get involved in any public activity during your school years, for example, or in college?
Very early. I'd get involved in these community-related issues as early as in elementary school and in high school. I was always elected the chair of something or other, of a class or of some other group. Or I would organize some clubs myself. But I remember both elementary school and high school as very difficult, as a difficult experience, hard and difficult, traumatic. I recall a lot of different conflicts.
Because it was a school in the previous system?
It was a school a school-like army barracks every time. These days, when I'm personally involved in school curricular work for children, I can see in what kinds of great schools these young people can learn, and I really envy them, in these wonderful, where you can really learn a lot in a manner having nothing to do with fear. And in my life, almost all of it, there was a lot of fear. There were many nasty, unpleasant things for years and years. And of course, when I later learned about Eastern philosophy, the mysticism of the East, and I really got interested in it, and I've been interested in it for many years now, it seems to me that I understand why it was happening, why I perhaps attracted such situations, where there are a lot of conflicts, a lot of tension, a lot of struggle, a lot of stress, and a lot of fear for somebody, or from something, from some situation, or from some people. Situations which I have had to cope with and face. And this was the case both with my father, from whom I often had to protect younger siblings physically when he was simply beating up on them or abusing them, and later on when I was older and I was in similar circumstances in school.
You were the oldest?
It's also important to me that not to see my parents and all these different people who took care of us as evil to the core. Absolutely not. And that's exactly what the whole tragedy of that situation was all about, and most likely still continues to be about that. And perhaps that's why, possibly, I choose social issues, and I get interested in how to improve people's lives, particularly those of children, how to make them happier, how to make them feel safer, because I've come to know life in fear. But I know perfectly well that every time all these people, whether my father or mother or my teachers or other guardians, even if they didn't know how to care for us, they really wanted to. They tried very hard. It's only that they didn't know how. They simply were not capable of taking care of little creatures.
You were the oldest of 4 siblings, right? Were you the oldest of all your siblings?
No, I was the second oldest.
Oh, and you had an older sister or a brother?
I had an older sister, whom you've met, an older sister who was older than the rest of us, but I love her dearly to this day. As you can see, we have a great relationship, and there are great contacts and relationships among all of our siblings, and we love each other. But she didn't know how to take care of us, so I took on a role for my younger siblings, a caretaker of my younger siblings.
You said that times were hard, that the family had financial difficulties. But you started college.
Yes, financially it was hard, as it was hard for 98% of Poles. But in comparison to a lot of others, I had it easier. Because I came from a so-called intelligentsia family, where father, as a doctor, made quite a decent living, and my mother also worked for a while. She was a manager of something or another. Yes, of course, there was college. I got to go to college because I couldn't imagine life without a higher education.
But why exactly the French department?
I think there were a few reasons. At this point, it's hard for me to remember exactly why. As an 18 or 19-year-old girl, 17-year-old girl, I chose French then. Probably for a few reasons. But I suppose that the main was the fact that studying Western languages or other such areas meant some way out of the country, some travel possibilities from the closed country. In a communist country where a passport, my passport, wasn't sitting somewhere in my desk drawer like in a normal free country, like in Poland today, but somewhere at the police station, and I mean the political police, there always had to be some justification to be allowed to leave the country, to go, to see things, to get to know other people, other cultures, other languages. So to me, it was always associated with an opportunity to travel, to see things, to get to know things, to leave, associated with freedom, to put it shortly. It was associated with freedom and with learning something new outside of the country that to me seemed gray, sad and poor, and a little bit like my home, a bit stifled, kind of a bit frightened. And this really was the case, because when I left Poland for the first time and went to Paris, it seemed to me an oasis of freedom, a completely different country, where people would often laugh in the street, were happy, and did what they wanted. I even remember small details, like when I would come to a cafe in Paris in 1960, I don't remember, 8, I don't remember, maybe in 9 when I left Poland for the first time, there was this little fact that people would sit down at a table in the middle of the room. It was amazing to me, because in Poland people would always sit down at the sidelines, somewhere on the side, in a corner. There was a lot of behavior that I found shocking. People weren't afraid to sit down in front rows in college. Nobody would hide in the back, but students, and I started college there. We liked sitting close to our professors, to the teachers, because they were nice, likable and warm people who wanted to share their knowledge with us, and not some castrators who would just, as I became used to in Poland, check attendance and enforce, almost with a whip, learning something, often quite useless.
So college in Poland was like kind of elementary school or high school, would you say?
Some classes were very good, on a good level, and I met very intelligent, competent people. But almost all of these people, these professors I had, were also, in a way, victims of the system. I mean that people were very distrustful and fearful, and it came up in a variety of ways, in such little things, for example, as the fact that they very rarely smiled. They didn't know how to show emotions, didn't want to, or were afraid to, so that classes were always like, I don't know, like some paramilitary camp or something. And I remember it quite well, since after I came back from France after a few years there, and after going to college there and such, I started working at the university myself as a teacher, as an assistant professor.
Po skończonych tam różnych zajęciach, studiach i tak dalej. I zaczęłam sama pracować na uniwersytecie jako wykładowca.
What year was that?
In 74. And I introduced this practice which didn't exist in Poland at the time, but which was common in France and which I liked there. That is, I got rid of what you'd call typical rows of desks, you know. Like that there's a lecturer and students sit in rows and the lecturer comes in almost with the sound of the bell, checks attendance, says his stuff, then goodbye, thank you, or quizzes people and leaves. And I introduced, first of all, I didn't check attendance. I just said that I wasn't interested in attendance, but in what they knew. So I didn't take attendance at all, which was a great shock to both the students and to some of my colleagues, who believed that by this I was undermining them for checking attendance, which was then mandatory in college classes in Poland. Second of all, I got rid of rows of desks. I mean, I arranged them into a square, you know, rows arranged into a square. I made a square out of desks, and we all would sit together. And during class time, we would select a person to take charge of class, who was responsible for preparing the next class, which meant that she had to do a lot of reading, studying, and consulting with me. And then we would teach the class together. Later, I introduced the idea of leaving the college walls, mostly because to me they were too much like military barracks, and we would have class in a park or in some cafe. Or I believed it was worthwhile to take them, and I taught a class in mass culture then, so I would go with them someplace where I could show them something, look at comics, think about them, or go to the movies together and discuss the issues.
W jakieś miejsce, gdzie mogła mi coś pokazać, komiksy, oglądać, to zastanawiać się, chodziliśmy razem do kina.
I taught classes in the French department and in the Polish studies department. And I was trying to introduce a slightly different style. And above all else, I introduced a habit which was then quite revolutionary. And I think it may still be in Poland and in many other countries. I mean, in our countries, where turning to another person is formulated differently in terms of language, linguistically, it is shocking. Since I introduced a habit of addressing each other by first names. In English, it's simpler, because you simply say ty, you, right? But not in Polish, where there is a very strict division between ty meaning you and pan, pani. I got rid of this, and I was on a first-name basis with my students. After a while, I realized that it was so far from what they were used to, that they were trying to take advantage of it, not understanding that there was a difference between this type of informal relationship and taking advantage of it. So that was something they needed to mature to. But in any case, we addressed each other on a first-name basis. And by the way, the age difference between us wasn't that big. So that's what I did, and I kept it up for very many years. It was also reinforced in the social tradition later introduced by Solidarity, that is in our trade union, a rebellious anti-communist union where everybody used first names. This tradition seemed to me, later there was the underground, and when I was in the underground and later it was like that in prison too, I also brought this tradition here, where I'm at now, to the president's office. Where at the beginning, now I admit I've changed it, but for the first few years I was on a first-name basis with all my co-workers, even though some people criticized this and believed it was too much like fraternizing in an institution that is by definition rather hierarchical, not to mention other more rational reasons for it. I'm talking about it without resolving whether it's good or bad. I'm only explaining my needs then, and how long they survived. I mean, the need for closeness with people. They need to talk to them. This freedom and equality need. I have no idea how somebody will manage to translate this kind of egalitarianism, exchange, sharing things with people, treating the fact that I was a professor as some sort of public service, as the Buddhists or Hindus would say serving. And that is, among other things, sharing and not speaking ex cathedra, not dividing people into lower rank students and higher rank professors. I have never done that.
And when you went to France for the first time, to the West for the first time, it wasn't just any year. 68, 69 was, after all, the year of the student revolt. So you ended up in the very epicenter of a volcano.
Of course, yes, exactly. It was fantastic. That was, among other things, the reason I went, because I felt so passionate about this. Of course, I had known a lot about this thing earlier through friends, and some friendships had already started, because of the fact that some French people would sometimes come to Poland. It was really awfully rare. Wouldn't usually work, really. The Iron Curtain, and Poland was a closed country. But I was somehow able to meet foreigners in a variety of ways, and they were really very exotic to me. And above other things, in Poland in March, and that was before May, the famous Paris or French May 68, there was the Polish March of 68, in which I was a very active, lively participant. Studying then at the Poznan University, I was one of the leaders of the student revolt then. I had some problems because of that. I was supposed to be expelled from the university. But luckily I got off somehow, etc., etc. So I was already experienced, so to speak, in anti-communist and student revolt in Poland. I somehow managed to leave for France for 2 months through, I don't know, some kind of a miracle, since it was terribly difficult to leave. It was right in 68, maybe in 69, I don't know. But at any rate, in France, I was lucky enough to fall right into the arms of students of the Sorbonne, which had by that time already split up into 13 universities, and make friends with them. These friendships, by the way, have lasted till today, and they're very strong. One of my friends whom I met at that time was a lefty, just as I had become a lefty, a gauchist. In the meantime, our views have evolved, of course, and he's a social democrat now. But he fell in love with Poland so much that, thanks to us, my husband, me, and our friends, Polish men and women, for years and years he has been interested in Poland, was helping Poland a lot, was helping Solidarity a lot, was helping the Solidarity Underground, to the extent that he became a chairman of the Polish-French Association.
And then when you ended up in France, during this period of a huge explosion of the student revolt, did you perhaps have any contact with women who participated in it, with these spiritual daughters of Simone de Beauvoir?
With the daughters, yes, and I actually even met her. That was when I went to France for a longer period of time. Not just for summer vacation, a month or two, but for 4 years. I chose for my studies one of these 13 Sorbonne universities, a very leftist university, not communist, but gauchist. That's how it was viewed, and still is actually, even though a lot has changed there. But it's still being remembered in France as left-leaning.
Za takim uchodził, za takich do dziś uchodzi, chociaż już się tam bardzo zmieniło, ale ta pamięć, że on był taki lewacki.
Every time I'm in France, I always try to stop by and see what's going on in my department, in these buildings of mine, quote-unquote. And this was Paris 7 in Saint-Cyr. That's where the university was, and it was absolutely dominated by lefties of all kinds. It's amazing that I ended up there. I also got to know French workers there, which was very interesting, because in Poland I didn't really know workers. I mean, I knew there were factories somewhere and some workers worked in them, but I was from an intelligentsia family, and I was dug deep in typical intelligentsia circles, academic in particular. While there, in France, I had contacts with people from various social circles, including those from this real lumpen proletariat, people who were workers, generation after generation. Feminist circles, on the other hand, were dominated by people, sociologically speaking, they were mostly from the intelligentsia, intellectuals for the most part, from various universities or actresses or artists in general. This way, I started being active in a feminist group which was called Psychoanalysis and Politics. I was really interested in psychoanalysis then, incredibly interested, so I was in this group. We even wrote some little brochure. My input in writing this brochure was not big and mostly through discussions, but it got written, I had it, and later on it disappeared, most likely later in some house search during martial law.
That's too bad, really.
And that's where the name Simone de Beauvoir appears, and those of other women, and mine too, among these co-authors.
And do you remember, perhaps, more or less, what was in that brochure? What found its way there? In general, what were the most important topics in your group?
Oh, a multitude of various topics, starting with those huge, I could say, strategic topics, such as peace in the world, how the world is ruled, what the goals are that are followed by the human race, to various major social problems. This huge concern of ours really was what brought us together, and not just the fact that women were discriminated against everywhere, which was obvious to us. Nobody had to convince us of that. We got together, so to speak, because we believed that. We were discussing discrimination, how to get rid of it, how to change it, and particularly friends. There was a lot that needed change. It was much worse than in Poland at the time when it came to that. I know that nowadays people don't remember that, but in France, even many years after the Second World War, actually till 68 or 70, but at any rate, certainly till the events that happened in May 1968, which plowed through, which changed France, this bourgeois France, a lot, really a lot. And not just French universities, but social norms, mentality, institutions, laws, and so on. It really changed it a lot. These were the incredible healthy fruits of this 68 revolt, this revolt in politics, social mores, and social issues. For example, in France then, for a long time, they had a law, I don't remember till what year, and I don't want to lie about it, but probably till 69 or 70, or even later than that, they had a law which made it hard for a woman to have her own bank account.
And what about...
Very often, women had to get approval from a husband or a father to do something independently. It's simply incredible, but that's how it was. It was possible for Polish women because it wasn't like that in Poland. But on the other hand, there weren't that many banks in Poland, so one couldn't really have that many bank accounts anyway. But this was for other reasons. It was simply a poor country, so bank accounts would immediately look suspicious. But some things there in France were shocking to me, because in Poland the norms were very different. And the norms were more egalitarian. In France, there was the rule that men talked and women sat in the kitchen or in the drawing room and chatted about crocheting and mostly exchanged food recipes. It wasn't like this in Poland, right? Wouldn't you agree with me? In my house, for instance, my husband would cook 100 times better than I did. I didn't like cooking. I have no culinary imagination. I don't think there is anything wrong with cooking, obviously, but for a lot of reasons, I'm not crazy about it. Perhaps in my subconscious there is some conviction that cooking would push a woman into the kitchen. And maybe I didn't want to be pushed into the kitchen. It doesn't matter, but I'm not crazy about cooking, while my husband loved it, and my son too, by the way. And to this day, they do it 100 times better than I do. So I was never into it. They would do their shopping, they would cook, they would make me tea, etc. But let's say that this is quite exceptional, even in Poland. But in France, it was completely, I simply never saw, almost nowhere, except in leftist circles. I never saw women not removed, not pushed to the sidelines into this drawing room or another room or the kitchen. It was a rule that men would talk about politics, about huge strategy goals for their country, for the world, and they, the women, would go on about these food recipes. So in these feminist circles, it was obviously very different. The rebellion was even stronger, because the more stifled you are, the more violent the rebellion.
Tamten bunt był jeszcze silniejszy, bo im uwalniasz się z większej uwięzi, tym bardziej to jest gwałtowne.
And was abortion law also a topic of your meetings?
Of course, in the abortion law. Just as I came to France, it happened to be at the moment when there was this initiative. I don't remember what it was called. There was this anti-abortion initiative. This written appeal by very famous women, intellectuals and artists, who came out in favor of a liberal anti-abortion law.
Pisemnego, pod którym apelu kobiet bardzo znanych, intelektualistek, artystek.
Abortion law, I mean, because in Polish, well, you know what I mean. Because abortion was punishable by law in France then. So they said, let's admit to having one, whether it was true or not. I don't know, and I don't think anybody cared except for the tabloids. They'd say, I admit I had an abortion, which meant you're welcome to lock me up. And it was clear that this bourgeois state, or as we'd say, repressive police state, would not lock up a famous actress or some great eminent famous lawyer, since Giselle Halimi was there, among others, a very well-known, very eminent lawyer, who's been taking on the hardest cases to this day, who has successfully defended and still defends a lot of women, who have been charged in court for purely, you know, discrimination or for reasons of morality. So it was clear that they wouldn't be locked up. And this appeal happened in turn. The catalyst for it was the fact that some modest woman, a worker I think, was to be locked up for having an abortion. And this appeal, this solidarity by these women from circles other than the quote-unquote working class, caused the laws to be changed. France got, I don't remember whether it was right after that, but it was relatively soon after these initiatives, after this appeal, which dominoed into more and more initiatives, including various actions at universities and in the streets, till it reached the parliament and was changed. But it must have been soon, because since as early as 1970-some, France has had a liberal abortion law.
Różne akcje przeprowadzone na uniwersytetach, na ulicach, aż doszło do parlamentu i zostało to stopniowo zmienione. Ale dość szybko. Właściwie już Francja od któregoś tam 1972 roku ma liberalną ustawę aborcyjną.
It must have been surprising to you that in that country, with all its freedoms, there was a restrictive law relating to motherhood.
Oh, well, yes.
It wasn't the case in Poland then.
Well, yes, but remember that this freedom has different faces. This is what I was learning there. That you come to a country where you have your passport at home, that is to France, where you can move freely around France or around other countries of Western Europe. But at the same time, there is a law so different than ours. We had a law that was liberal then, and theirs was restrictive. I was learning about social norms of the West then, that this freedom can assume different faces. For them it was surprising too, that, you know, in a police state like ours, you could have an abortion any time, which was the case, in fact.
When you came back to Poland in 1974, you started working at the university, and soon after that you got involved in opposition work, right?
Yes. Actually, my opposition work started already in France, in anti-communist opposition. It started in France right away because, among other things, work in these groups with which I was close, leftist groups, was anti-communist. They were all strongly anti-communist, very anti-totalitarian. Yes, you could say that they were more than anti-communist. They were anti-totalitarian and very willing to help anti-totalitarian movements here, which at that point didn't really exist. There were no movements there there were little ferments, tiny little rebellious groups. Poland was at that point already after the famous letter by Jacek Kuroń and Karol Modzelewski, directed against the Communist Party. Later on, they were locked up in jail for this letter, and in the letter itself they appealed for some liberalization of policy. So little and so much. And they got a 3 and a 3.5 year sentences. One got 3 years and the other got 3.5 years for the same letter, by the way. And later more sentences and more jail time. So then the post-68 opposition was already starting to emerge, a bit more organized, you know. I came back to Poland when there was no KOR yet. KOR didn't exist yet, since it was created a 1.5 years later. But the ferment was already there. There were people who wouldn't hide their anti-communism. And I quickly got close to these people, to Karol Modzelewski, to our friends in Poland, from Wrocław, from Warsaw, to Adam Michnik, with the whole group, which later became KOR. And later there was KOR, the Committee for the Defense of Workers, which was an illegal, acting legally, not in hiding, but according to the authorities, an illegal little organization, so to speak, an aid group for workers. And at the same time, when there were repressions in Poland, when repression started, one more wave of repressions targeting the workers, there emerged a group made up of intellectuals and members of the Polish intelligentsia who we simply helped, raised funds, got people out of prison, looked for legal aid, etc., etc. It was very different in Poland then, because people were obviously incredibly afraid. I don't know if I should go into detail here.
Don't go into detail, but I'm still curious how you felt then, after you had worked in this all-women's group. Since in these leftist or lefty circles in which you moved, and about which you're speaking so warmly, there were these all-women's groups. Didn't it seem interesting to you, just for your own interest, to try and transfer this style of work into the underground? Was creating similar women's structures, women's groups, did it make sense at all in the Polish situation? Didn't it seem to you that it could have been attractive in a way? Didn't you feel that work was different somehow in these all-women's groups than in co-educational groups?
You know, first of all, when I came back from France to Poland, they all seemed to me, and I mean including all the people who were active in this anti-totalitarian movement, they seemed incredibly conservative to me. And I loved them like a family, or I loved my family like I loved them, it doesn't matter which. They were simply the people to whom I was strongly attached. There was this great warmth among us, and we gave each other a lot of support. That's what it was like emotionally, that there was a lot of devotion and a lot of warmth. On the other hand, very often I had different views on a lot of issues, different from those held by the people who are now very famous in Poland, but were yet unknown then. These were views about social norms, and particularly about feminist issues. I had a lot of disputes with such people as Adam Michnik or Staszek Barańczak, who now lives in the United States and is an important professor teaching at Princeton, I don't remember exactly. And they believed I'll give you an example of how it was, and it was symptomatic for my state of mind then, and theirs too. They believed that I was a wonderful person, but with some loose marbles, with one little screw loose, one little deviation, this feminism. And they often teased me because of that. There often wasn't any malice in it, but they teased me nonetheless. This shows you that even in such open circles, where people protested against repression by the authorities, but they also gave permission to be repressive. Since repression did exist in parts of society, the reaction was so strong, from ridicule to sarcasm to real serious criticism, sometimes quite vicious, of my attitudes and views. It means that these people were impregnated with this kind of outlook to a really large extent. And this, together with the lack of understanding for the issue of equality between men and women, of discrimination. They didn't see that not because they were bad people or stupid, but because it was completely beyond the sphere of their interests. Everybody watching this will perhaps know this by heart, because that's how it is everywhere, in every country. There is some unique element, we know that perfectly well, but It's a problem that's been described and analyzed thousands of times, etc. Why there are still various people behaving like this, enlightened, open people, it would seem. Of course, this anti-totalitarian group had something like that too. That's one thing, but of course there were discussions about this, but it was neither a priority nor an issue planned for, but rather unimportant in my male colleagues' view, and sometimes also in mine. But the difference between us was that I was often terribly furious about it. Even today, I can see how much of my energy went into these issues. Nowadays, I would probably act differently, but then I fought against everything, including such automatic behaviors that have by now become anecdotal, like, you know, we need to talk about this here, and you, Basia, could you bring us some tea? It may seem funny, and it was amusing, and really no big deal, but that's just how it started, but it went further. And when there was something more serious, they deal with it among themselves. Or the fact that undertaking the issue, I mean intellectually and conceptually, undertaking the issue of equality for women, sex equality, was not even in the picture. Also, we need to remember that these types of issues were really very often undertaken by the official state-controlled journalism. I don't want to sugarcoat PRL, but that really was the case. So these issues were often associated with the official PRL propaganda, with the pseudo-equal perception of male and female issues, where both were prisoners of the communist system. But I believe that today we can certainly say that, with today's distance perspective to what happened, you know, with this good, healthy distance to what happened, to the totalitarian communist system in Poland, with all the criticism of that system, I nonetheless believe that it did something, that it caused the women's issues and the status of women to be noticed and discussed, that social norms changed in Poland, and the situation of women in the Polish People's Republic, in my view, was decisively better than in France of the 60s and 70s. You may not agree with me, but I believe that's how it was, and I'm ready to defend it in every court.
Dyskutowany, że obyczajowość się zmieniła w Polsce i sytuacja kobiet, moim zdaniem, w Polsce, w PRL-owskiej Polsce była naprawdę lepsza niż we Francji. W lat 60. czy 70. Być może się ze mną zgodzisz, uważam, że tak jest. Jestem w stanie tego bronić przed każdym sądem.
I just wanted to ask, I just wanted to go back to, God forbid, I'm not going to dispute that. I'd like to go back to this tea story. I left not because I believe it's
I know, it's awful.
I think it's awful. This direct method of eliminating your opponent. Basha, go and make some tea. This way Basha's gone. The most literal kind of marginalization.
Yes, for one, and...
She's not there, for example, when a decision is made.
Yes, I'm talking too much. I don't know how this videotape works, because it will be a lot of work for you later. It will be too much work for you later. But the second problem, which was, in my opinion, harder to solve, to overcome and to undertake, was the fact that in these anti-totalitarian circles, this problem was outside of the realm of interest also for women, even more than it was for men. Perhaps they thought that if they undertook the issue, talked about it, it would put them into an even harder position than if they hadn't done it. I mean, in relation to their group, where we'd speak about freedom for the workers, where we'd speak about how to change the communist system, which had been repressing us without violence and so on. Because that's what our thinking was like, based on the spirit of Mahatma Gandhi's movement. Since we didn't want to use weapons or kill anybody, and yet we wanted to change Poland and its political system.
Ruch jak Mahatmy Gandiego, bo myśmy nie chcieli bronią zmienić, sięgając po broń, chcieliśmy kogo zabijać, a chcieliśmy jednak tą Polskę zmienić, jej ustrój polityczny.
But that means that...
I don't know a single, I can't remember, and I wouldn't want to be unfair to anybody, but I can't remember a single female acquaintance or a friend from that period of time who would have been interested in this issue. Yes, it did happen, yes. When they happened to have problems with their partners or husbands, they would come to me for help, yes. But I mean various kinds of help, psychological, legal, or something. Of course, I sometimes discuss this issue with my friends, and particularly with my university friends, you know. I don't know, perhaps I helped open somebody's eyes to this. I hope so, because it was the issue I was really interested in, obsessively so, as many of them claimed. Obsessively, because everything would get on my nerves then, upset me. I mean, for example, the fact that my female colleagues didn't want to run for office, even within this minimum level of democracy that was available at universities. And in comparison to other institutions, universities then in the 70s or the 80s in Poland were these oases of freedom. And at various levels, it was possible to run for office freely and to be elected. And generally, there was no cheating. But women regularly refused to run, for one thing. And second of all, they would regularly vote for their male colleagues. I talked to them about this many times, and frankly speaking, quite recently. A female friend of mine, who is a provost at a university today, reminded me of our conversation, our discussion, when as early as 25 years ago, I was trying to persuade her to run for the Dean's Council as a representative of young assistant professors, because I believed she would be great in that position. And she would tell me no. I won't do it because our male friend, some John Doe guy, who was simply hopeless, had no leadership skills, was not a good organizer, wasn't able to formulate his thoughts well, was very imprecise, wasn't a good listener. So he had all the qualities which should disqualify him as a representative of employees' interests. And she had all the right qualities. And I believe I had them too. And she didn't want to become a candidate. And I was already involved in the opposition at the time, so there was no chance for me to be elected, because it was known that I was active in the opposition and that the security cops were after me, interrogating, harassing. Anyway, people were sometimes afraid to talk to me, to meet with me, and it was obvious that a person like that stood no chance of winning a college election. And besides, I was already active in trade unions.
Does that mean that...
You know, limited as they were, but I thought I wanted to help people, and I was active in the trade unions at our university. I was helping people and taking care of some social issues.
Did you already know at that time that... Did you talk to other women about it? That men simply, you know, guys were willing to place themselves at the top, and that it was hard for women to get to the top?
Sami siebie ustawiają chętnie na pierwszym planie, że trudno jest kobiecie wejść na ten pierwszy plan.
Was it at this point a topic of some backstage discussion?
Well, yes, of course it was. I've already mentioned that it was. Since I was trying to persuade them to run for office, if they were qualified to do so, then it was an issue that we discussed. My male colleagues were often good bosses or leaders, but women? I don't know what kind of bosses or leaders they would have made. I don't know this because they never wanted to run. They would not give themselves that opportunity, you know.
Nie wiem tego, dlatego że nigdy nie chciały kandydować. Po prostu same sobie nie dawały szansy. Wiesz?
Certainly this topic of a double burden was also...
I, in turn, was with the opposition, where there was no need to run and nobody would elect you and nobody would nominate you, but you choose this path yourself, and it was a very difficult path. But there were a lot of women there. In this anti-totalitarian movement, there were a lot of women, but even there, it would be the same every time. I don't know. When there were some interviews for the press, journalists from the West, of course, would come from the West to talk to somebody competent in a more or less secretive way, to somebody active in this anti-totalitarian movement, to get an explanation of what it was all about, why we were doing this thing, and not something else, what our goals were, what we wanted, our goals, what was leading us, how we imagined our Poland. When they would come, they always ran into men. Women would always refuse to be interviewed. When something was associated with importance, with prestige, women would give up on it themselves. Our male colleagues never did.
That's how it was in the movement. And when freedom exploded, so to speak, in 1989, the issue of the abortion law came up as one of the first important topics, which also divided the opposition. Was it a shock for you? What was, at the time, the most important issue for you? Was it what was going on at the round table? Or rather these social processes, which could have been shocking to you as a person sensitive to women's issues?
które no, mogły Ciebie jako osobę uwrażliwioną na sytuację kobiet, które mogły być jakoś szokujące.
Did you get someone involved in the abortion law issue already in the spring of 1989? Was it the most important thing then?
In 79?
No, in spring 1989, right before the free elections.
So we're leaving out everything before 89?
You know, there are a lot of materials about that.
Exactly.
And this side of you is quite well known, so one can just read about it in many places.
Well, no, it comes up. I think that she knows about it.
This material will be attached to this interview, unless you want to say something about this topic.
No, I don't. I'm just asking because it really explains what was going on in 89.
Well, if you wanted to say something not covered in those books, it would be very interesting.
No. It's all in those books. But just let me say in a sentence or two that in Polish Solidarity, our Solidarity, there were a lot of women who were active. Half of this anti-totalitarian movement, of these 10 million, were women. I mean, statistically, and it's all researched and analyzed. There were regular membership lists, dues, lists of those who paid dues. In the leadership, on the other hand, there usually were no women. Because as it turns out, this movement was, in this aspect, a mirror image of social norms. It was the same. It was both that women didn't want to run, and I remember trying to talk them into it, and that they weren't usually elected anyway. There were very few of them. For example, among the 19 members, if I'm not mistaken, of the National Presidium, that is the national leadership of Solidarity, there was one woman. And that's what it was like in the majority of regions and majority of structures. On the other hand, women were very willingly took charge of all the tasks that were very useful but of little prestige, such as office work, archives, press distribution, collecting dues, accounting, etc., etc. But everything that was called the political politics, so to speak, in French, politique, politicien, was done by men. Strategy, action goals, struggle against communism, against the police, and so on, it was all males. And it remained the case for a very long time after that, has been carried on until today, actually. But yes, of course, I was deeply involved with the Round Table. Of course, at the Round Table, it was the same thing. Among 60 people, there was one woman. From the Solidarity side, that is, there was one, a single one.
Who was that?
It was Grażyna Staniszewska, a wonderful activist from Solidarity in Bielsko-Biała. But none of us who played a really important role then in the underground and took part in it, only our male colleagues who sometimes, many of them hadn't really played such an important role, but they were all elected, co-opted, invited, while we weren't. I mean, myself and my female colleagues who, I believe, played a great, incredibly important role. We did a lot for our country and its people. But I had a job all this time. At the Round Table, I was simply producing a bulletin, which we published every day. A bulletin informing the public about what was going on then in Warsaw, about all these incredibly difficult, important, great negotiations, which simply changed the system, through negotiations, through evolution, and not through violence, not through shooting people, killing, tortures, and prisons. We were changing our country. So I was very much interested in it. Later, of course, there were free elections, and I ran for the same. Most of my female colleagues didn't even want to run, so there were terribly few of us, but there were few of us nevertheless. Later, I became a representative to the Sejm, and when I got to the Sejm, I was interested in issues related to changes, in changing all of this, dissolving the totalitarian institutions, changing the law, and also changing the norms, the social norms, So I was interested in everything that's related to these issues, so the issue of abortion became something like a fifth, third, fourth priority. But later it blew up suddenly, so that I had to react somehow.
Are you already talking about the movement for the referendum?
No, I'm talking about the proposal to abolish the liberal abortion law, since it was before the movement for the referendum emerged. So first there was a proposal filed by the right-wing politicians from Solidarity, that is from my side, the right-wing politicians who decided to abolish a liberal law that existed during the times of the Polish People's Republic, and to introduce a very restrictive one in its place. It introduced jail sentences for both the women who would undergo an abortion and for doctors and for all others involved in conducting the procedure. And there was a really big splash around this issue. I wasn't that passionately involved in it at that time because I was busy with foreign affairs. I was in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I was also busy with the media. I proposed, for example, and it was my first step as a Sejm member, the idea to abolish censorship in Poland. And it was practically a legislative initiative, a historic one, about the institution of censorship, since there had been regular censorship in Poland. And I proposed, and this is what interested me. But suddenly abortion popped into my field of vision. And because I had these feminist views about freedom and equality, it seemed obvious to me that I should speak about the matter, that I would defend my point of view, and that I would defend a free and liberal law. And suddenly it became clear that gradually I was being perceived as some leader of this movement, as the main carrier of the idea that many perceived as terrible, as PRL-like, repulsive and communist. And I was strongly attacked by the church and by the right wing of Solidarity, and worshipped by former communists, who loved the fact that I was doing that, and not just they, but a Solidarity activist like me as well. It just all got really mixed up, incredibly so. And it caused me a lot of trouble and difficulties in my political group. But at the same time, I believed that this issue needed to be taken care of, that it was difficult, and even more difficult because it got involved in all these political games. I was considered a traitor to Solidarity ideals. So in a sense, it wasn't just about abortion, because suddenly it turned out that it was the main point of collision between the Solidarity people and former communists.
And when did you notice?
And at the same time was also a real women's issue, in which women felt incredibly kind of lost, kind of neglected, pushed aside, manipulated out. And their interests were manipulated because the political struggle started between Solidarity and anti-Solidarity factions through this very problem.
Między grupami solidarnościowymi i antysolidarnościowymi poprzez ten problem.
And when, from your Sejm member's perspective, did you notice that there was a feminist movement at work in Poland? At what point did you notice?
Well, no, that happened very quickly, because first of all, most of these emerging groups would come to me. So it wasn't like something was going on and I didn't know about it. A lot of groups, as they were organizing, and sometimes even just two people, would get together and they would come to me since they thought that I would become the third person. No, since the very beginning I have been tracking and in a way participating in the creation of very many groups. Between 89 and 99 there appeared around 37 organizations. I remember because I had them all registered, particularly since I started the Parliamentary Women's Caucus in the Parliament then. It was really atypical, a world phenomenon in a sense, the kind of an institution that didn't exist anywhere else. And its uniqueness was about, and I say that without any megalomania, but just in purely descriptive terms. The idea was to bring together female Sejm members and senators, female senators, who would come from different political parties, with different worldviews, and often with different political pasts, but who would agree to act together for the benefit of all women, around this slogan I then made up, Women for Women. And I managed to create something like that. Of course, most of my Solidarity female colleagues didn't agree to participate in it because they believed it was dominated by former communists. And I understood their point of view and didn't bear any grudges, but till this day, I believe that it was a great, wonderful idea and one of the most wonderful things I've ever managed to do. Particularly because we really succeeded in doing a lot, in the form of something concrete and palpable. And that is the legislation, which has been a success and has not been a success, so to speak. I mean, it was and was not a success, the abortion law, I mean, because it won once. I myself spoke in the Sejm 6 times about the proposal for changes to the abortion law. 6 times. Once I managed to win, beautifully, wonderfully win, and our liberal proposal passed in the parliament, but it was vetoed by the president at that time, Lech Wałęsa, my former colleague from Solidarity, while my former opponent from the Communist Party, Aleksander Kwasniewski, the current president, decided to support it. And among other reasons, because of that, I decided to support him in turn, and that's why I currently work with him. I don't know whether it's clear how strongly my life and my behavior were impacted by my attachment to freedom, aspirations, and equality needs for women. I don't know, because it ultimately decided whom I've supported and where I work.
Potrzeb, nie wiem, kobiet, bo właśnie to zadecydowało, kogo ja poparłam i gdzie pracuję.
Could you know, I don't know if I'm saying this quite confidentially now, because many of my feminist colleagues don't realize that.
What is at this moment, what is important for you now? What are you working on now, and what else would you want to do?
Now I'm working in the president's office. I work on issues which I believe are very important from the social perspective, such as drug addiction. These are mostly very difficult issues. I work on very difficult and often depressing and sad things, but I believe they're very important. It's drug addiction, and in general some other social pathologies. I work on unemployment. I'm in charge of this really great program with the Americans. I'm in charge of a program on women's safety, very big, which in turn is really nice and really effective, I hope. And I hope that I'm helping a lot of women. Several thousand of women have gone through this program of mine, and I often meet with them. Of course, I can't meet all several thousand at the same time, but I often come to seminars which are conducted in a number of different Polish cities. And I see that they're happy about it. And I am happy too.